Mr. Clerk has advised me that we have a quorum and that the witnesses have, and those members have been sound tested and all are okay. So with that, I will call meeting number 89 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills, Social Development, and the Status of Persons with Disabilities to order. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is resuming its study on implications of artificial intelligence technologies for the Canadian labour force. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, meaning members are participating in person in the room and virtually. You have the option to choose the official language of your choice to participate. Those appearing virtually use the world icon at the bottom of your surface. If there is an interruption in the translation services, please get my attention by using the raised hand icon. We'll suspend while it is being corrected. I would remind members appearing in the room to keep their headset clear of the mic to avoid the translators from getting hearing feedback from your device. We have so that's it. I would also ask members to speak clearly and slowly for the benefit of the interpreters. We have today two panels. With the first panel as an individual, appearing virtually is James Besson, Professor of Technology and Policy Research at Boston University by video conference. Angus Lockhart, Senior Policy Analyst, the Diocese at Toronto Metropolitan University. In person in the room, welcome. And appearing virtually, Oliver Carrière, Executive Assistant to the Quebec Director of UNIFOR by video conference. And welcome back. I believe, Mr. Carrière, there was issues the last time, so thank you for coming again. We will begin with opening statements, beginning with Mr. Benson. We'll begin with Mr. Benson. Are you ready for 5 minutes or less with an opening statement?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. I'll just say a few words.
Thank you.
So AI has gotten an awful lot of media hype, and I think that makes it very confusing to understand what its impact will be. I tend to view it as much more continuous with the kind of changes that information technology has been bringing about for the last 70 years. Particularly regarding the role of automation. So there are tremendous and exciting things that AI can do. Some of them are very impressive. Many of them, unfortunately, are still very far removed from the point where they can replace labor. And in fact, what tends to happen is, and this has been true throughout the period, automation mainly pertains to automating specific tasks of a job rather than the entire job. And a lot of people misunderstand that. There are very few jobs that have been completely automated by technology. I looked at the U.S. Census and identified occupations that had been completely automated by technology, and I only found one, which was elevator operator. Other jobs were lost. Other occupations disappeared because technology became obsolete or tastes changed. So we no longer have telegraph operators, and we no longer have boarding house keepers. But that's over a period where technology has had a tremendous impact automating tasks and affecting labor and affecting productivity. So what that means basically is there's been a lot of fear mongering about AI causing massive unemployment. We've been using AI since the 80s. We're not seeing massive unemployment. I don't think we're going to see massive unemployment anytime in the next couple of decades. But we are going to see many specific jobs being challenged or disappear and new jobs being created. And so the real challenge of AI for the labor force is Not that it will create mass unemployment, but it will require people to change jobs, to acquire new skills, maybe change locations, new occupations. And these transitions are very costly and can become burdensome and are really a very major concern. There's a second thing I'll point out, and I don't want to be long here, but another major impact is AI, and this is true of information technology. It has been true of information technology for the last 2 decades, has done a lot to increase the dominance of large firms. So we see that large firms are acquiring a larger share of their markets. They're much less likely to be disrupted by innovators in the traditional Schumpeterian fashion, where the startup comes along with a bright new idea and replaces the incumbent. That's happening less frequently. That's important for a number of reasons, but it also affects the labor force in a couple of ways. One is large firms tend to pay more, in part because they have advanced technology, and this tends to increase wage inequality. So information technology has been leading to boosting differences in pay, even for the same occupations. We'll see big differences from the same job description will pay much more at a large firm. The second thing is, because of that, in part, there's a really significant talent war. With these new technologies, having specific skills that work with the technology, and I'm not just talking STEM skills, but I'm talking about all sorts of skills that of people who have experience adapting their skills to work with the technology. They're in great demand, and large firms have an upper hand in the talent wars. They're better at they'll pay more, and so they can recruit more readily. There's nothing bad with them paying more. We want labor to earn more, but at the same time, it means that smaller firms, in particular, innovative startups, are having a harder time growing. And we see that the growth of startups has declines in areas where large firm hiring is predominant. So that becomes sort of an indirect concern for labor. Let me wrap that up then. Thank you.
President, Mr. Lockhart for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the invitation to address this committee today. My name is Angus Lockhart. I'm a senior policy analyst at the DAIS, a policy think tank at Toronto Metropolitan University, where we develop the people and ideas we need to advance an inclusive, innovative economy, education system, and democracy for Canada. We feel privileged to be able to contribute to this important conversation today. And in addition, we do have a brief that I've co-authored with Viet Vu that we're submitting and is hopefully going to be available soon. Today, I'd like to talk about 3 things: what we know about past waves of automation in Canada, what the DAIS has learned.
Mr. Lockhart, could you just slow down a bit?
Yeah. Today, I'd like to talk about 3 things: what we know about past waves of automation in Canada, what the DAIS has learned from our research into the impact of automation on workers, and how the current wave of automation is different from what we've seen before. First, I want to set some context for my remarks. The concern for workers in an age of automation is not new. In fact, it's been ongoing for more than 200 years since machines started to enter the economy. What we've seen through many waves of automation, and in the end, is not mass unemployment. For the most part, we've seen increased prosperity. Our research at the DAIS suggests that AI, much like past waves of automation, the risk from AI to those whose jobs are likely to be impacted is smaller than the risks to Canada of not keeping pace with technological change, both on productivity and on remaining internationally competitive. This, however, does not mean that there aren't any bad ways to use this technology or that adoption won't hurt at least some workers and specific industries. The question has to be how we can support workers and be thoughtful about how we adopt AI, not if we should move ahead with automation. The good news is that we're still in the early stages of AI adoption in Canada, in Canadian workplaces. Our recent research shows that just 4% of businesses employing 15% of the Canadian workforce have adopted AI so far. Less than 2% of online job postings this September cited AI skills. Most people are not yet exposed to AI in their workplace. This is likely and hopefully going to change over the next decade, making now the time to act and put in place frameworks to support responsible adoption and workers. In order to do so, we ought to understand how this technology differs from what came before it. Probably the biggest change in the latest wave of large language models is how easy they are to use and how easy it is to judge the quality of their outputs. Both the inputs and outputs of tools like ChatGPT are interpretable by workers without specialized technical skills, compared to previous ways of automation that required technical skills to implement in the workplace and produce outputs that were often not interpretable by lower skilled workers. This means that the new wave of AI tools are uniquely positioned to support lower skilled workers rather than automating entire tasks they previously did. Evidence from some initial experimental research suggests that in moderately skillful writing tasks, the support of a GPT tool helps bridge the gap in quality between weaker and stronger writers. That said, we also want to acknowledge that previous waves of automation and digitization in Canada have not had fully equitable outcomes. While in general, increased prosperity has improved the quality of life for all Canadians, the benefits have nonetheless been disproportionately concentrated among historically advantaged groups. With AI, we run the risk of this again being the case. It's currently being adopted most quickly by large businesses in Canada, and those tend to be owned by men. However, because we are still in early stages of AI adoption in Canada, there is time to make sure it's not the case. We can't afford to miss out on the prosperity that AI offers, but we need the prosperity to uplift all Canadians and not just a select few. I want to end by saying that there's still a lot of work to do here. At the dais, we're going to continue to research and try to understand how generative AI can be, and already is, used in the Canadian workplace, and what the impacts for working Canadians are. Our work relies on data collected by Statistics Canada in surveys like the Survey of Digital Technology and Internet Use. We're glad to see this committee is taking a serious look at this issue. Continued support for and interest in this kind of research it puts Canada in a better position to tackle these challenges. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I'm happy to answer questions when we get there.
Thank you, Mr. Lockhart. Certainly challenged the translation services. That's fine. Thank you. Now, Mr. Carrière, for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. The fundamental challenge with the eyes that we do not have any information. There's no framework for lots of different elements, and it seems that is an issue that's being pushed back to the unions. And in fact, the unionisation is only at 15% in private sector. So we cannot actually provide the framework and support for the introduction of AI in the workplace. There needs to be a regulatory framework that needs to be handed down by the governments at all levels. We don't know anything about this. By mistake, we've used certain articles in the collective agreement about technological change to deal with AI. That really was an error, because often the triggering elements within collective agreement clauses are related to a loss of job because of technological change. But that really misses the point when it comes to AI, because AI actually manages lots of different aspects which don't actually result in a loss of a job. We talk about AI as something that's positive, that's going to alleviate work for workers, but unfortunately we see that there are negative dimensions, reduction of autonomy and increasingly intrusive surveillance. Workers are being constantly put under surveillance because the algorithms need to be fed data in order to do their work. These data, we don't know how they're actually stored, we don't know how they're actually analysed, and we don't know how they're actually being reused or recycled, if you like. So the collection capacity has not been covered by a framework. We need to have a framework around how we're going to use the data, and there needs to be a framework, and we need to make it mandatory to have dialogue between workers and salaried workers to see how we can explain all of this and ensure transparency, because there's no transparency for the moment. For years now, we've been using tools that make decisions instead of workers, but these have not been presented as algorithm management tools or AI. Rather, people have just said, this is a new tool. And I'll give you an example of this. In Bell Canada, the blueprint tool for the customer service reps, and I'm afraid we've lost the sound. So when there's a conversation with a customer, they have to follow a decision tree that tells them what to do, depending on the problems that are raised by the customer. So there's no judgment that can be exercised by the worker, and the worker has to actually populate the tool so that the different interpretation scenarios are actually effective and appropriate for the customer. So we eliminate the judgment to be exercised by the worker. And we're doing that in lots of different sectors. For example, in the transport sector, truckers, it's algorithms that decide instead of them what is the best route that they should use or the best driving practice to be used. We completely sweep away their own judgment as workers, and we completely sweep away the capacity of individuals to actually drive their own vehicle. You have to follow the instructions imposed upon you by a tool. So there needs to be frameworks, and the OECD has set up 4 basic principles around artificial intelligence. It should be geared towards sustainable development. It should be human-centered. It should be transparent and explainable, and it should be a solid and responsible system. We don't have any of that at the moment because there's no disclosure. There's no mandatory disclosure. We believe that's the first step that needs to be taken. Namely, we need to be aware of these tools, understand their impact, and then develop solutions so that we can really be efficient or bring added value thanks to using technological tools in companies. There's a labour shortage currently, and we cannot say that we're going to change a customer service operator into someone who's going to be able to program algorithmic-based tools. That's not at all possible. In Quebec, there's 9,000 to 10,000 workers that are lacking in the IT sector. And we have other workers who are not able to fill in this shortage. It's a vicious circle, really. We need to break that circle, and we need to start by having mandatory disclosure. There needs to be a mandatory conversation between employers and their employees. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur
Thank you very much, Mr. Carrière, for that.
Begin with the first 6-minute questioning round with Ms. Gray. Ms. Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. My first questions are for Angus Lockhart from the Toronto Metropolitan University. You had written as part of an article where you stated, while some medical practices benefit from the inclusion of AI, there are serious privacy risks in feeding private medical data into a computer model that must be addressed. I just want to confirm that that was something that you had written. And do you believe that Canada's privacy laws are adequate to address these privacy issues?
Yeah, that is something we wrote. I think I co-authored that with Viet Vu as well. I don't know, strictly speaking, if the medical laws are accurate. I do know that AI is going to require new forms of medical privacy. As data gets fed into these large algorithms, there's an opportunity for the algorithms to spew that back out in a way that we don't or can't anticipate. And so it requires a degree of care that is larger and more significant than previous sort of tools. We've seen with ChatGPT and tools like it that there's a risk that whatever gets fed into them can come back out, and it's very challenging to incorporate systems that will prevent that from happening, or at least to make sure you're extremely confident that it won't happen.
Thank you. Do you believe that there are security and privacy concerns which are currently barriers to adoption of AI?
So we did a study on adoption of AI in Canada, and what we found is that for the most part, very few businesses are actually looking at security and privacy concerns as a barrier to them. It was something like less than 3% or somewhere in that range of businesses that have yet to adopt artificial intelligence cite anything like that as their concern. For the most part, people really just don't know what tools are available to their business.
Thank you. Do you believe that if government were to amend privacy laws, that this would help to remove some of those barriers? And are there concerns that privacy laws in Canada may not be helpful to protect people's privacy?
Yeah, I think there's room to provide more clarity for businesses on what the privacy concerns are and what they need to be really careful about. To some strong degree, probably a lot of that will have to fall on the developers of the actual AI tools and not the businesses themselves implementing them. But in general, I think that there's always room to help support that, but it probably isn't going to be a massive driver of increased adoption in Canada, even if it were improved.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. My next questions are for Professor Bezin. You contributed to a paper last year which talked about AI startups. Do you think AI development poses ethical and data access issues?
Yeah, definitely. And we found, we surveyed AI startups about the kinds of ethical issues that they were attempting to control, and they saw a very definite need. They in fact took many. We were surprised actually. We thought that ethics would be sort of the last thing on the radar, and in fact, the majority were actually implementing things and actually taking actions that had some teeth in them. So in some cases, they let people go. There were concerns about bias that might arise in training. So yes, ethics has been important. I think it's going to become more important as these systems develop and we understand more about what they can do and what their effects will be.
Thank you. Do you believe Canada's privacy legislation and protections are sufficient to address concerns with AI development?
I'm sorry, I'm not a Canadian, and I'm not that familiar with the Canada's privacy laws.
Do you believe that new AI technologies will create issues for workers with respect to intellectual property and antitrust issues? Issues concerning around ownership of data and privacy.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Well, so there's a bunch of things. So first off, there's a huge issue in terms of intellectual property, copyright in particular. So particularly with these large language models like ChatGPT, they're trained on a bunch of of data that is out there, much of which is under copyright protection. It's out there on the internet. It can result in cases, and some of these have been very clearly demonstrated, where they are more or less reproducing copyrighted material without permission. Antitrust is also an issue. So I referred earlier to the effect of information technology generally increasing the dominance of large firms, and AI is going to, I believe, accelerate that tendency. So it's not directly a problem, an immediate problem for antitrust law, but it means that antitrust law is going to become that much more important as the dominance of these firms grow.
Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I've only got just a few more moments here. If I could just add on then, what would you recommend that the Canadian government be looking at specifically, especially around privacy laws? What recommendations would you give?
Well, yeah. So in terms of privacy laws, in terms of intellectual property, I think there are some strong recommendations about copyright that, need to be affected, and that's going to be a big problem to work out. In terms of privacy laws, it's much more difficult, and it concerns the use of to what extent privacy-protected information is being made available to AI systems that may reuse it in a different way. This is the problem that the other speaker referred to. That is.
Thank you. You can continue that with another questioner. Thank you, Ms. Gray. Mr. Coteau, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. I found each of your testimonies interesting, and they actually complemented one another as well. So I'm going to start off with a gentleman from Unifor, Mr. Carriere. I hope I pronounced it properly. You spoke about, just the way unions will be positioned in this as we further adopt AI. And I thought it was interesting, the way you actually spoke about a regulatory framework being necessary. And I understand that part of it. But the piece that is interesting to me is outside of the government regulation, if unions are not part of the big private sector jobs that are growing, like the other two, well, Mr. Besson talked about how these big corporations will dominate a lot of the space. But outside of the public jobs, what is the strategy for organized labor to work to to make sure that they're protected, their workers are protected through the collective agreement process, if they're not necessarily part of the growth that's taking place? Any thoughts on that?
Merci, M. Coteau.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koto. The issue that we have is that for the moment there are no discussions with employers about this issue. There's no discussion being held on the potential impact of the integration of this type of new technology. There will only be discussions if we know in advance that there's going to be an impact in terms of job losses. But there's no framework or anything that obliges both parties to have a discussion to see how a job is going to be changed, how is it going to be simplified or become more complicated. There's no structure around this. And the labour movement, once again...
In this conversation, from your perspective, who would be included in this conversation if the jobs are not necessarily coming from, union jobs? Like, how do you envision that?
Dans un contexte où...
Well, in a context where there's no union, there needs to be a governmental structure to set up committees with workers to explain to people this is what we want to implement and this is how it's going to impact your work and this is how we're going to be able to correct the negative effects or the perverse unsolicited effects of algorithmic-based management. So if in the algorithmic-based management, if there are certain elements that cause involuntary discrimination, then we need to be able to correct the application or the management tool, because the management tool is basically replacing the manager. So we need to equip ourselves so that we can build something here. We're talking about building something collectively, building these management tools together with workers and employers. And if we see then that there are certain errors or negative trends, we want to be able to correct these. So that means there needs to be dialogue with workers through some type of structure, which is not necessarily a union one, but we do need to have some sort of structure set up.
Thank you very much for being here. And I think the organized labor's voice is very important in this conversation. And I do appreciate the fact that you joined us here today. So thank you so much. Mr. Lockhart, I had a question. You said that 2% of jobs that are actually being published today, job vacancies, cited AI skills as a requirement. Do you think that's a true reflection of the actual sector itself, or just jobs themselves, 2%? Or do you think because it's becoming easier to incorporate AI without specific skill sets, which I think you cited, the 2% is a really underrepresentation of what skills are actually required, or what tools can be placed into the job without the employee needing those specific skill sets? I hope I made sense there.
No, that makes total sense. So what we saw was that just 2% of all jobs have any kind of AI skills. And you're exactly right in saying that those AI skills are sort of traditional tech-based skills, things that require sort of advanced training to use. And there is sort of a generation of generative tools and new tools that take natural language inputs and so don't require the same technical skills to use. That said, there still is that whole range of technologies that require those digital skills and those technical skills to use. And the new technologies aren't necessarily replacing them. They're more additive and they're more operating in new areas that the old technologies didn't help in. And so there's still going to be increased demand and increased need for AI skills broadly. The same workers who don't have AI skills and are not being asked for AI skills are going to be able to adopt the new tools, but they might not necessarily be able to use any of the older existing tools.
Thank you. Chair, do I have any more time left? I have one more question, if possible.
Yes, 35 seconds.
So I was very fascinated, Mr. Besson, with the, how you started off your conversation by saying there was a lot of media hype around AI, and this is just a continuation of a 70-year process. And hopefully, sometime over the course of the remainder of the time, can get a little bit more details on that, because I thought that it is a very fascinating and popular subject, but I'd like to hear more about why you think it's being part of a long story rather than something that's new. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Capture that in another question. The time is out. Maintenant, Madame Chabot, pour 6 minutes.
So you now have 6 minutes, Madame Chabot. Good morning. Good morning, Chair. And dear witnesses, thank you for being here today. That's very important. Even if we don't have any of, or not all of the answers, and we're not aware of everything that's at stake when it comes to implementing AI in the workplace. Mr. Carrière, I've got a question for you. Right away, you set the scene by saying the problem is that there is no information and there is no support framework. Would you like to explore these two matters in more depth, please? Thank you, Madame Chabot. Well, currently, it seems it's unions and employers that have to come up with a magic wand. But I think there needs to be regulations from the government at a provincial and federal level in the light of their respective jurisdictions. The first stage to understand the impact of algorithm-based management is to be aware of what's going on. There needs to be information. We need to consult salaried workers. That's the first stage, which will then ensure transparency and explainability. Because at the moment, the only effects that we see in terms of AI are, in fact, the negative impacts. We see the fact that work is being reduced rather than increasing. And we see that a decision-making tool, an IT application, is taking decisions in our place and is doing the so-called troubleshooting rather than allowing individuals to do that. Our impression in our unionized workplaces where we're observing the application of algorithm-based management actually means that workers are finding themselves in a situation where they're being dehumanized. This is a strong term to use, but basically we're telling individuals, we don't need your judgment. We've got an IT tool that can do it for you. So that demotivates people, that demobilizes them. And people are just automats that are executing certain things without ever having to think for themselves. Yes, please do continue. So people are not aware of the fact that they're being replaced, and they're being asked to populate these tools that will then replace them. So we need to get down to brass tacks here. And first of all, through the Labour Code, there needs to be a mandatory discussion, a declaration as to what type of tools are going to be used in companies so that we can then determine the effects. Unifor represents millions of workers across Quebec and Canada in several sectors of activity as well. So specifically, in certain sectors more than others, have you observed that all of this has already started? Have you already seen the impact on certain categories of jobs? Yes, massively. It doesn't just date back to yesterday. For several decades now, through technological change, we've seen this. For example, in the telecoms sector, Bell Canada, over the last 15 years, we've seen these surveillance monitoring tools used and other tools that capture and record all the data done by workers to measure their performance and measure their incompetence, perhaps. And with Bell Canada, there's a system for performance management that's based on stack ranking, where an individual who's in the last quartile has been met to deal with their performance because the algorithmic measurements had shown that all of the performance criteria had been met at a weaker level than the others. And as you're weaker level, then there's a performance management plan that's imposed upon you, notwithstanding the manager's discretion. He doesn't have any judgment. In fact, he bases his decision on the AI tool to then take a decision about his workers. So we've seen that in the telecoms world and also in the transport sector. Everyone who's driving a vehicle is under 24-hour surveillance 7 days a week. All of the data is captured, recorded, and once again, the algorithm tools are replacing the individual's judgment and expertise. So it will say to a trucker to get from A to B, I'll tell you how you need to get there because it's more efficient. So we're really removing all the judgment skills from a worker. They're being replaced by these tools. So we have several examples of this, but we're not aware of any of this because unfortunately it hasn't been disclosed in this way. If it doesn't have an impact on job losses, then we don't talk about it. But there are several jobs that have disappeared. Often we saw it 5, 6, or 8 years later after the implementation of the tools. We never have this sort of discussion. That's why we need to have mechanisms, first of all, to inform and consult workers, and then build the tools in a collaborative way, and thirdly, have a means to actually adjust these as we go along. Are there any examples of any social dialogue that has been set up, for example, in Quebec? I know there's the commissioner for the partners on the labour market where there's some social dialogue, but in workplaces, has anything been set up? Any good practices? Well, it's very embryonic. And this is a real deficit. We're already in catch-up mode. We're chasing the train that's already left the station. Well, it's worrying to see that we're moving ahead, but at the same time, we're not keeping people informed. And in workplaces, we can see that there are certain consequences. Thank you very much, Madame Chabot. Thank you, Mr. Carrier. And now, Madame Zurilla.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Very interesting testimony today. I'm going to ask Mr. Lockhart initially my questions, and if I have time, I would like to ask some questions to Monsieur Carré as well. Wanted to talk a little bit about the points you made around the increased prosperity and how that's not potentially going to be equally distributed equitably among workers. This is really, my questions relate to protections of workers. So you mentioned a responsible framework. Wonder if you could expand on what you think that responsible framework or those responsible frameworks could look like on a federal level.
Yeah, I think that's probably a very challenging question to answer in a short time. What we certainly view as part of a responsible framework is making sure that when artificial intelligence is implemented, it's not being done in a way that's harmful to the workers who are using it explicitly. So there's always risks of like increased workplace surveillance, facial recognition being used in the workplace, and we definitely want to avoid any kind of negative impacts from that. But beyond that, there's a huge risk from AI that businesses will be able to implement AI and reduce labor, and the increased productivity, the benefits from that could just be concentrated among the ownership of the business. And that runs the risk, obviously, of increasing wealth inequality in Canada. So at the dais, we strongly believe that prosperity and GDP growth is beneficial for Canadians, but only when that's distributed among all groups. And I don't think I have an answer for how to make sure that the benefits that come from increased productivity for workers is distributed among all of the workers and the people in the firm, but I do know that that's going to be an important part of keeping up with AI adoption.
So thank you for that. And do you think then perhaps the federal government could lead an advisory council or a roundtable? And if so, who do you think should be on there? What groups should be represented?
Yeah, I think that is definitely a path that needs to be investigated. I think that when you do that, you need to make sure that all groups are represented. So obviously you need to make sure that industry is represented, but having unions there is important. And I think the trickiest part is making sure you have non-union workers represented there in some capacity, because a large portion of Canada's workforce is not unionized. And if those voices aren't present at the table, you really run the risk of a sort of a two-tiered system for union versus non-union workers.
Thank you so much. Mr. Carré, I just have a question also around the protection of workers, and you talked about it. I mean, I'm worried about populating the tools with workers' ideas, with their skills, with their experiences, but then those workers never receive any of the benefit of that. All of their intellectual property, their cognitive property, and even their copyright rights are potentially at risk. So I wonder if you could expand on how we protect workers' ideas, their skills, their experience, and yeah.
Well, being a union, we've seen that the tools are there to make the work easier for workers. But the negative side of this, as I've mentioned, is that we take away their autonomy, their judgment, and individuals are turned into automats that just have to apply a pre-established recipe that's been set up by the algorithm. For example, with Blueprint in Bell, an installation technician in telecoms has to absolutely write down all the different stages. The aim of his visit is very basic. It's not too complicated, but the worker has to explain what they have to do, and the machine then says how he should do this. So people are just executing tasks. So in our union, we don't have people who've got specific intellectual property on their ideas. They are people who have to implement certain tasks. But now we're taking away their personal judgment and their expertise, and we take away the fact that they've got all this experience in this sector, and the pretext an algorithm can take any unknown factor and do the same work. So that is a negative effect on workers. The work is becoming boring, so simple to carry out that there's no challenges, which means that people leave the company and look for a different job. We want to use AI to fill in the labour shortage, partly, but by making the work uninteresting, it just means that there's a great deal of turnover and attrition of workers. So it's not really so much about protecting people's ideas, but rather to make sure that human beings can actually contribute to the company where they're working and contribute and bring their values and their skill set and their knowledge. But for the moment, what we're observing is that the tools are not having that effect.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take this less than a minute just to ask Mr. Besson. We recently experienced the writers and the actors strike down in the United States, and it also affected up here in Canada, and I'm from BC, so it put a lot of people out of work for over 6 months. So I wonder what was learned around AI in regards to the recent strike in the actors and writers field.
Yeah, I'm not sure we've learned much about AI specifically. There have been a number of studies done on using AI to assist writers, and there's some evidence that it helps less skilled writers do a better job. I don't think AI is anywhere near the point where it can really replace writers. So, I think that was being talked about, but I don't see any evidence that that's about to happen or can happen. And I've seen my own experience and experience with a whole number of other people who have tried to do writing with ChatGPT or whatever. There are some huge limitations in using this technology at this point.
Mr. Aitchison for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Besson, I'm going to start with you. I'm actually just going to ask a question about housing. Frankly, that's my portfolio, and it's one of the areas where I know in the United States there's a huge challenge with housing as well as there is here in Canada. And a big part of the problem is the lack of supply and the pace at which things get approved and plans and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the application of tools like AI to speed up the approvals process, for example, in municipal zoning and that kind of thing. Is this? When you made your comments, I keep thinking about the fact that this is a tool to be used, not to be afraid of, but it presents opportunities, and I'm hopeful that maybe it presents some opportunities in the housing sector.
Well, that's certainly an interesting idea and one I haven't thought about before. But I immediately see it runs into a problem, which is, all of the regulations and requirements that go into approvals, they're not something that an AI system can just ignore. AI may be helpful. I mean, you'd like to be able to see ways that perhaps the various regulators would be able to use AI to analyze the various reports and speed up that process. But they'd have to be willing to do so. And you might see ways in which AI could help compile all of the various approvals. So I think there's possibilities for it to work. I think it's a difficult problem because there's a big interaction between regulations and laws and the technology. And you could very easily see a situation where AI gets used and then there's a lawsuit because somebody didn't like the outcome.
In an industry that is incredibly over-regulated, I would suggest that housing is generally over-regulated. You made a comment there that made me think, well, maybe AI is a tool that could be used, like you say, to compile all of the existing rules and regulations, but maybe it could actually, it could be a tool that could analyze the layers of regulation, the layers of bureaucracy involved, and trim the process and eliminate a lot of overlap. Is that potential, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, AI can make recommendations about what to trim, but it can't trim in itself. Obviously, it requires legal and regulatory approval to trim the process.
Okay.
It's a good idea.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Lockhart. I'll ask you to just provide some commentary on the same question, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I think I would say two things. The first is that when we switch from talking about AI use in private workplaces to AI use by government, I think that there's a lot of different questions that raises and a lot of different issues that come about. In the private sector, a lot of the time we get to just focus on productivity, but in the public sector, there's a lot more to consider than productivity. And so you can't just talk about making the process faster because there's an important equity concern here when it comes to even housing applications, I think. And so handing over any kind of judgment on that to an AI tool makes for a real challenge. The second is more so on the topic of using AI to cut down on regulations. I think you're going to really, again, run into a challenge there because there are real social considerations as opposed to just productivity or efficiency considerations that go into that kind of regulation system. And so it seems to me that it's probably better done and left to humans and human decision making for now.
I'll throw it to Mr. Carrière as well, if you're interested in commenting on that, sir.
Sur cette question précise.
Well, on that specific question, I'm not going to answer. I don't think I have any added value when it comes to AI and housing. However, I would like to reiterate once again that we have to have more knowledge about these tools. In order to do that, we have to talk about it. There needs to be some sort of framework that forces employers to explain to their employees what they want to do, the aims they want to meet, and the changes that this will bring to the workplace and their autonomy in a context where there's going to be more work, that's great. But if it's in a context where work is actually going to go down, that's a problem. So all this starts with knowledge. We need to know what we're dealing with. We don't know whether we're dealing with algorithm, automated decision tools or semi-automated decision-making tools, or is it symbolic, or is it a question of machine learning? We don't know enough about this. Workers do not know whether the algorithm tool is able to think for itself or if it just follows a flowchart or a decision tree. So we really need to set up mechanisms to understand this.
Carré. Mr. Who we got? Mr. Kuzmarchek for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and I have a question for Mr. Carrière. If Liberals believe in the power of the bargaining table, and that's why we introduced Bill C-58 that will replace that will ban the use of replacement workers. It's what differentiates us from the Conservative Party. We believe in the power of the bargaining table, and we're putting forward the ban on replacement workers. Are you able to comment? Has the specter or AI? Have you seen it being part of discussions already at the bargaining table? Are you seeing in negotiations currently with employers? Are you seeing AI being raised in those bargaining discussions? And I'm not sure how much time you've spent at those bargaining tables, but can you tell us a little bit if it's part and parcel of those discussions already?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for that question. Currently, we're not seeing this in a precise, open way around the bargaining table. We're not having discussions about this. I'll give you an example. Recently, with the Saint Laurent Seaway, came to a work stoppage for 8 days. So would an algorithm management tool actually manage the locks remotely? Probably, quite probable. Will it lead to job losses? Quite likely. Is this discussion being held around the bargaining table? Absolutely not. There's no disclosure about this, no openness. So for the moment, with workers, it seems that they have to use all of their bargaining capital, that's an in-house term. Instead of improving their working conditions, they're being asked to use up all of their bargaining capital in order to get transparency around AI. So that's not useful for workers. They have to keep their bargaining capital for bargaining on other matters, because employers are not disclosing the way in which the tools are being integrated, nor are they talking about the way in which the tools are going to have a future impact on their work. Of course, we're asking for a great deal of collaboration from workers to come and populate the data for these tools and to try and correct certain error margins, but we don't explain to workers how this will have an impact on their job or how their job will evolve over time. There is no dialogue. We have to start somewhere. Of course, the bargaining table could be one starting point, but for all the sectors where there's no union representation, there need to be mechanisms in place to still hold that dialogue.
I appreciate that response. And I know that Unifor, even back in 2017, was hosting conferences and meetings on AI, on technology. So you're definitely not new to this issue and very much forward looking. I wanted to ask whether is there dialogue between unions? So, for example, the UFCW, are there conversations between Unifor and, let's say, UFCW in the food processing, food picking sector? Are there conversations with other unions? You mentioned, for example, ports, to have that discussion. Are there conversations taking place between unions as well, too, regarding the concerns regarding AI?
Oui.
Yes. There are lots of conversations between different groups because unions share the little knowledge that we are able to build, because we know that everything is very much an embryonic stage. There are certain technological elements that were set up 15 years ago, and now today, with the arrival of AI, they've really started to take up a great deal of space. So it's not just American and Canadian unions that are having these discussions. International unions are having discussions and exchanging possible best practices and examples of frameworks that could be included in collective agreement or in some other sort of structure via legislative means. So there are discussions underway, but at the end of the day, it's still embryonic. We don't know anything. And we need to have this dialogue with employers in order to develop solutions. The aim is not to restrain or limit the impact, but rather we want to make sure that there's going to be added value for our jobs rather than reduced added value. So yes, there are discussions underway.
A few seconds, Mr. Kuzmerchek.
I will yield all my time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kuzmerchek. Monsieur Carré. Madame Chabot pour 2 minutes et demi.
2.5 minutes for you, Madame Chabot. Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Carrière on the employer-employee relationship. Now, if you've got an algorithm which is a decision tree for a certain function to be carried out, who actually gives the orders? And what happens if there's a mistake made? Or if the worker, well, who's actually answerable to whom here? Who's the boss? I think the employer-employee relationship changes as a result of this. And I'm rather astonished to see that even currently there is not being more upstream dialogue about all this. But to come back to Bell, what does that actually imply for a Bell worker, all of this? Well, if you take a Bell worker, Bell Canada is a Canadian company that uses a great deal of data and does a great deal of surveillance about lots of different types of jobs. Everything's recorded. Lots of activities in a computer are actually recorded, so all the actions and gestures carried out by a worker are known to the employer. Same thing for a transport worker out on the road, or everything is measured, everything is recorded there. And these people are managed in terms of objectives to be met, and the objectives to be met are determined as a result of data analysis. So if we say to a technician that it's going to take 25 minutes to set up a connection, but in fact it takes 35 in reality because there's been some weather events that were not covered in the algorithm, then this person will be penalised in their work and will say that they're not doing a good job because they haven't met the objectives that have been set by the algorithm. That's where we're at. So has the manager's judgment actually be replaced by an algorithm? The answer is yes, and for a long time. But we're not aware of all that because we don't really measure exactly what this implies. When we ask the employer to disclose the criteria that they were using for their management tool, we don't get any answer because it's so specific. They just don't give us any information. So the manager has been replaced by an AI-based management tool. And for us, if we want to challenge this decision, we base ourselves on what? That's important, Madame Chabot. We cannot go to arbitration or go before the courts and ask and challenge an AI management tool why they took a certain decision. So that's why I said we need to have some way of correcting these errors that are made by AI decision tools. That's our perception of things. So managers today are people who will pass on messages, but when it comes to judging a worker's performance, it's been replaced by a machine.
Madame Chabot. Madame Zarello to conclude this.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Mr. Carrier, hopefully we can just keep it to about a minute, because then I would also like to ask Mr. Lockhart about equity. So thank you so much, Monsieur Carrier, for bringing back the humanity part of this discussion. We are a committee that is human resources, human resources as the title of the beginning of our committee. So I just wanted to visit something that CLC, the Canadian Labour Congress, came and testified in front of this committee and recommended an advisory council on artificial intelligence. And I'm wondering if you would agree with this recommendation that the federal government should have an advisory council that looks at the impacts on human resources, and if so, who should be on that advisory council? Who should be represented?
Well, that would be an interesting first step. So yes, we need to start off with this type of advisory structure, and yes, employers need to be there, and unions and all of the different workers' associations need to be involved. We need disclosure, openness. We need to use simple language because it seems so complicated to us. We need scientists, we need people who can actually explain this in layman terms. And we also need workers to feel safer because they're afraid that they'll be replaced by machines. That's not really what we're seeing, but we are dehumanizing work nevertheless. So unions need to be round the table, but also all the other types of workers' associations need to be included. And we need to have people who can actually explain this to us in layman terms.
Thank you so much. Mr. Lockhart, I just wanted to revisit on the equity, and again, this committee also looks at persons with disabilities. So I wonder if you could just share a little bit about the work and discussions that are happening in your organization around what equity needs to look like in relation to AI.
Yeah, AI has the potential to actually both promote equity but also harm it. If we look specifically at persons with disabilities, there are examples where AI has been used to actually improve the capacity for people with disabilities to operate in a workplace. So there's a cafe that's recently opened in Tokyo that uses robots to help increase the motor function of people with disabilities and help them fully operate within that workplace. But at the same time, if you don't take an equity lens when you're implementing artificial intelligence, those marginalized groups, people with disabilities, other groups like them, are going to be the first people to be harmed by the introduction of AI in the workplace. So you have to start from a place of asking, how can AI help uplift and increase the participation of everyone, and use that as your framework instead of starting with the point of, we have AI, what can we get rid of with it?
A little over. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing for this first hour on the AI study. With that, we will suspend for a few moments while we bring in the last group, second panel of witnesses. So we'll suspend for a few minutes. Suspend. reconvene the committee as the witnesses, now all appearing virtually, have been sound tested, and I've been told they're fine. So we will begin with opening statements. I would ask everybody to keep their time within the 5 minutes or less, because we have 4. We will we'll start with Mr. Author. 5 minutes or less, please.
Terrific. Good
You
afternoon.
first showed up on my list, so that's why you're going first, Mr. Otter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for having me. My name is David Otter. I'm Ford Professor of Economics at the MIT Department of Economics and also co-director of the MIT Shaping the Future of Work initiative. I'm honored to speak with you today about my research on artificial intelligence and the future of work, and I apologize for my cold. AI presents obvious threats to workers in the labor force. While machines of the past could only automate routine tasks with clear rules, AI can quickly adapt to problems that require creativity and judgment. It seems reasonable to worry that AI will suddenly make huge swaths of human work redundant. I believe these concerns are somewhat misplaced, however. Strong demand for labor has persisted throughout past periods of technical change, like the industrial or the computing revolutions, and all signs point to growing labor scarcity, not the opposite, in most industrialized countries, including Canada. Instead, the important question to ask is, how will AI impact the value of human expertise? By which I mean the skills and judgment in specific domains like medicine, teaching, software development, or modern crafts such as electrical work or plumbing. Will new technologies augment the value of human expertise, or will it make human judgment valueless? In industrialized economies, expertise is the primary source of labor's market value. Consider the jobs of air traffic controller in comparison with crossing guards, both of which have the job of protecting lives by preventing vehicle collisions. Air traffic controllers in the US are paid 4 times more than crossing guards. Why? Because they have scarce expertise, painstakingly acquired and necessary for their important work. And that value of the expertise is augmented by tools. Without GPS, radar, and two-way radio, an air traffic controller is basically a person in a field staring at the sky. Crossing guards provide a similarly valuable social service, but most able-bodied adults can serve as crossing guards without formal training, without any expertise, and this virtually guarantees low wages. While technology makes air traffic controllers' expertise valuable, it can also make human expertise redundant. London cab drivers used to train for years, memorizing all the streets of London. GPS made this expertise economically irrelevant. It's no longer necessary. So you might ask, why isn't all expertise eventually made superfluous by automation? The answer is that human expertise becomes relevant because its domain expands with social needs. Jobs like software developers, laparoscopic surgeons, and hospice care workers emerged only when technological or social innovations made them necessary. In fact, my co-authors and I estimate that around 60% of all jobs that people do in the US today didn't exist in 1940. Technology and other social forces can just as readily create opportunities for high-quality work as it can automate it. I believe that AI can create novel opportunities for non-college workers, low and middle-educated workers. With the support of AI tools, these workers could perform tasks that had previously required more costly training and highly specific knowledge. For example, medical professionals with less training than doctors could tackle more complicated tasks with the assistance of AI. In the US, in part due to technological innovations such as software that prevents the dispensing of harmful drug interactions, nurse practitioners have proven effective at tasks formerly reserved for doctors who had 5 more years of medical education. AI could push this further, helping workers with less training deliver high-quality care. This is not to say that AI makes expertise irrelevant, just the opposite. AI can enable valuable expertise to go further. AI tools enable less experienced programmers to write better code faster. They help awkward writers to produce more fluid prose. This positive feature of which I'm speaking is not guaranteed. We must make collective decisions to build it. For example, China has made substantial investments in AI technology, in part to create the most effective surveillance and censorship systems in human history. This is not a preordained consequence of AI, although it depends on it, but it's a result of a particular vision of how to use this new tool. Similarly, it's far from inevitable that AI will automate all of our jobs. But that's a vision that many AI pioneers are pursuing. I think this would be a mistake. To shape this protean technology, AI, to constructive ends, political leaders must work with industries, with NGOs, laborers, and universities to build a future where machines work in service of minds. Let me end by saying what government can do. I don't claim to have complete answers here, but let me say a couple things. First, governments should germinate and fund human complementary AI research. The current path of private sector development has a bias towards automation. Government can correct this by supporting the development of worker augmenting AI in industries like healthcare or education or skilled craft work. Second, I would prioritize protections for workers. Using AI for undue surveillance, for high stakes decision like hiring and firing, and for appropriating workers' creative works without compensation should be disallowed. Empowering workers to collectively bargain and including them in rulemaking is a critical step. I'm also concerned about AI safety, but I think that governments are comparatively well equipped to regulate safety. So let me end by saying, rather than asking, what will AI do to us? We should ask, what do we want AI to do for us? Answering that question thoughtfully and acting decisively will help us build a future that we all will want to inhabit and that we will want our children to inherit. Thank you very much. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Other. Ms. Hadfield, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Jillian Hadfield, and I'm a professor of law and of strategic management at the University of Toronto, where I hold the Schwartz-Reisman Chair in Technology and Society and a Canada CFAR AI Chair at the Vector Institute for Artificial Intelligence. I'm appearing in my personal capacity. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you on this subject of such critical importance. I want to highlight 4 key aspects of the impacts of AI on the labor market. First, AI is a general purpose technology that is likely to transform almost all aspects of our economy and society. Second, the latest advances in AI can be adopted relatively quickly, but Canadian businesses to date have been slow to adopt AI. Third, current AI systems are rapidly evolving to perform highly sophisticated tasks, meaning that high income and education occupations may face the greatest exposure to this latest round of automation. And fourth, the profound impacts of AI across our economy and society demand regulatory shifts to ensure the full benefits of AI can be realized. Let me go through each of these in a little more detail. First, AI is a general purpose technology. This means that it will transform almost all aspects of our economy and society, similar to the impact of the steam engine or information technology. For example, publicly available large language models, such as generative pre-trained transformers, GPTs, demonstrate the potential for AI to radically reshape the nature of work. These systems are designed to understand and generate human-like text, including computer code on a massive scale, and increasingly to reason and problem solve, facilitating an almost unlimited range of applications. Second, the latest advances in AI can be adopted relatively quickly. ChatGPT's swift integration into everyday applications over the last year demonstrates this and suggests that the most recent strides in AI can be implemented relatively quickly, outpacing the adoption rates seen with earlier iterations of this technology. This presents an opportunity for Canadian business and policymakers to boost productivity and economic growth. However, the committee should be taking note that Canada has to date been slow to adopt AI. According to a study by Statistics Canada, only 3.7% of companies were using AI at the end of 2021. Studies conducted by IBM and the OECD also suggest that Canada lags other economies adopting according to AI adoption metrics. Third, AI systems are rapidly evolving to perform highly sophisticated and complex tasks. Specifically, AI is being fine-tuned into sector-specific software applications. A notable instance from my own field is CoCounsel, which is an LLM system built on top of GPT-4, functioning as an AI legal assistant for tasks such as legal research, writing, and document analysis. CoCounsel has managed to achieve a higher score on the American Uniform Bar Exam than the average test taker, in fact, 90% of test takers, and is also designed to address inherent risks such as AI hallucinations. Other examples beyond LLM systems include things like AlphaFold, which has solved the protein folding problem described by a leading computational biologist as the first time an AI system has solved a major scientific problem. These advancements mean that AI can be harnessed more safely and effectively, particularly in sensitive and cognitively complex domains like law, science, and healthcare. In one study, OpenAI researchers found that GPT exposure was higher at the higher income and education levels. And that's something for us to take into account, thinking about how this will look different than previous innovations. This brings me to my final and crucial point. The profound impacts that AI will have across our economy and society demand regulatory shifts to ensure the full benefits of AI can be realized. Our current legal and regulatory frameworks were designed for a pre-AI era and may restrict innovative and productive uses of AI in workplaces. To harness the benefits of AI, we must update these frameworks to address unique challenges and opportunities that AI presents. Furthermore, given the nature of AI as a rapidly developing technology, effective governance of AI demands that policymakers move quickly to adopt an AI-enabling regulatory posture which seeks to properly regulate risks, as we do with all other economic activities, while supporting innovation and investment. In conclusion, we stand at the cusp of a transformative era, and we should be acting to ensure that the benefits of AI are realized equitably and responsibly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hatford. Monsieur Lepage Richer, for 5 minutes.
Oui, bonjour, merci.
Yes, good afternoon. So I'm Théo Lepage Richer, and I'm Social Sciences and Humanities Researcher at the University of Toronto. First of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you today. They are the product of my research into the governance of AI. This is a subject that I approach by combining historical research with public policy analysis. During previous meetings, several members of this committee raised the following question, namely, how can we develop governance frameworks that are adapted to technologies evolving as rapidly as AI? This is indeed a legitimate question. It's regularly raised by suppliers of this technology to encourage a certain restraint on the part of public decision makers. But I'd like to qualify this question by pointing out the broader trends that the history of AI in Canada helped to highlight. So early federal AI programs offer a useful historical precedent to examine the impact of this technology on the organization of work. As early as the 1960s, the Pearson administration identified AI as a promising technology for reducing costs associated with hiring qualified personnel in the public service. In 1965, the National Research Council received the mandate to develop its first AI program. The aim was to tackle the translation of official documents from English into French. As a strategy, program managers opted for the development of software tools that would divide the translation process into simple subtasks. One such tool, for example, was designed to produce literal translations of common nouns and verbs in a text, and then the operators could conjugate them, add the necessary determinants, and revise everything. So the aim of these tools was to standardize specialized tasks such as translation to the point where they could be entrusted to workers with no prior training, but above all at a lower level on the pay scale. Although it was not conclusive, this program initiated a series of reforms aimed at reducing the government's dependence on specialized workers, but above all at re-establishing a certain level of control over the federal machine. Under Pierre Trudeau, programs such as CanUNet and Teledon were put in place. The idea here was to create the necessary infrastructure to produce new data about the work of federal employees. In a recent article published by Fenwick, McKelvey and myself, we suggest that the aim of these programs was to quantify the work of public servants so that it could be more closely monitored using the new data analysis tools that were developed in government and elsewhere. 50 years on, fast forward, AI applications in the Government of Canada and elsewhere have changed. But in those early programs, we can see that there are early signs, precursors of broader trends. Rather than completely replacing jobs, AI tends to be deployed to, for example, restructure tasks so they are entrusted to workers with a more precarious status, or limit opportunities available to workers to exercise their own judgment, reduce organizations' dependence on certain forms of expertise, and replace investments in training and workforce development. These trends go beyond AI, of course, but as Paulo Tubarão and her colleagues have pointed out, these trends nonetheless tend to characterize the platforms, management practices, reforms, and business models that depend on this technology. So as such, it is urgent that the impact of AI on the workforce becomes a key perspective for developing proper tailored policy responses. This position is shared by many, including Emmanuel Moss and Valeria Di Stefano, who point to the inability of the risk assessment-based approach that characterizes current regulatory instruments to account for issues related to worker protection. To reflect the impact of AI on the workforce, these instruments would need to take into account the impact of this technology on wealth distribution, job quality, and the loss of salaried jobs to precarious or subcontracted positions. So far, AI has been seen in Canada as an industrial policy issue and not without some success, but it is crucial that investments in the AI industry should complement rather than replace similar investments in human capital. Although future applications of AI are difficult to predict, their structuring effects on the organisation of work remain stable and can therefore guide policy responses to technological change. They are technology proof. AI is as much a labour law issue as an industrial policy one, and I encourage the members of this committee to consider AI trends over the past 60 years in order to put in place the necessary protection measures to ensure that workers also benefit from the large-scale deployment of this technology. Thank you.
Monsieur Lepage-Richer. We now have Ms. Jansen. Ms. Jansen, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you for the invitation to share my thoughts with the committee today. My name is Nicole Jansen. I am the co-founder and co-CEO at AltaML. AltaML is the largest pure-play applied AI company in Canada. We create custom AI software solutions for enterprise-level clients, both in the private and public sector. We're not quite 6 years old, but we've already worked with over 100 companies on over 400 AI use cases. So I base my thoughts today on my observations of those projects, the current and near-term capabilities of AI, as well as my knowledge of the AI ecosystem. I want to start by saying that AI will absolutely disrupt the Canadian labor force at all levels, professions, and across all sectors. And the work this committee is doing to understand those impacts is incredibly important. I'll start by addressing the elephant in the room around massive job losses due to AI. That seems to be the largest concern that we hear around jobs and AI. Of the 100 companies that we've worked with, not one has implemented an AI solution and then made resulting job cuts. What we're seeing is that the AI tools are being used to increase productivity, and in most instances are only capable of augmenting humans, but not fully capable of replacing them. The fear of job losses from AI is consistent with the fear that's come for hundreds of years when a new technology is introduced. It can be traced as far back as the introduction of the mechanical loom. However, every single new technology advance in history has led to more jobs at higher wages. Overall, there will be net gains in the job market from AI, but certain jobs will absolutely see disruption. And in fact, we're already starting to see that disruption. Jobs that require consuming large amounts of information and synthesizing it, such as content creation, or in the legal profession, paralegals, for example, that will see significant disruption. Jobs that require manipulating large amounts of numerical data, like research analysts or financial analysts. AI can identify trends in the market much faster than a human being can. Jobs that provide some form of external repeatable assistance, like call centers, receptionists, or even executive assistants, will see disruption. Software engineering will be disrupted and already is being disrupted as AI becomes more and more capable of writing high quality code. From what I have seen, these jobs won't disappear, but rather the individuals in them will need to adapt how they do their jobs, and their time will be focused on the higher value work. You may have noticed that a lot of those jobs I just mentioned are white collar jobs. AI is designed to mimic cognitive function, and it's likely that higher paying white collar jobs will have the most exposure to the technology. That said, industrial robots and drones also use AI technology, and that's the one place I see a high likelihood of replacement of jobs such as in the factory line or warehouse workers. This is a transition we've been seeing for many years, though, through automation. And then delivery persons over time, high likelihood to be replaced by drones. Jobs where a human touch or relationships and people skills are required will become more and more important. While these professions likely will use AI to support them, they will not see the same kind of disruption. So professions such as teachers, nurses, doctors, therapists, human resource managers, sales managers, public relations. Then we'll also have new jobs emerge, jobs on AI development, cybersecurity, ethical oversight, change management for AI integration, data labeling professionals, hardware specialists for AI, prompt engineers. These jobs didn't exist a few years ago, and now you see job ads for them everywhere. What's clear is that the people of any profession who choose not to adopt and use the new technology will be the ones who lose their jobs to those individuals who do adopt the technology, because they'll be far more productive. Sectors that adopt AI will be more productive and put more people to work faster. If we use AI to approve building permits significantly faster, that puts a lot of people to work a whole lot faster. If we use AI to perfect our preventative maintenance in our plants, that will ensure more uptime and more work for more people. The productivity growth that AI has the potential to create is a huge advantage for Canada, as we currently face both a long-term labor shortage challenge as well as an incredibly low productivity as a country. We must embrace AI with careful consideration and proactive measures, investing in education and training programs that equip individuals with the skills needed in an AI-driven economy. We must also implement policies that ensure inclusivity, diversity, and ethical use of AI. I'm here today to share my thoughts, partly because I know how important this topic is, but also because I knew I could rely on ChatGPT to formulate the version 1 of my comments that I could then edit and put my own thoughts to, allowing me the efficiency to say yes to this request. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Jensen, for a very informative presentation before committee this morning. Before we begin this round, committee members, we may only get one. 6 minutes, going to take 24 minutes. So that's going to run us close. So if some of your colleagues want to share, that's entirely left to you. Because I feel we'll probably only get the one round. Having said that, we'll begin with Ms. Ferrari for 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today to testify on behalf of our study on AI and the implications on employment and the labor force. Ms. Jansen, if I can start with you, I really enjoyed your testimony, and I loved that you used ChatGPT to help you through this. It's an interesting tool that I see happening with our students as well in education, using it as a tool. One of the things you talked about is this sort of fear of the change, and that almost is a human psychology thing. We've seen this, as you mentioned, throughout time. It's natural evolution. It's inevitable progression to move forward. But in the past, what was sort of the defining factor that pushed it forward in your, if you have any sort of historical reference of that? When you talked about the mechanical loom, when we look at the, vehicles, airplanes, so many people resist that change, but it ultimately increased prosperity, not replaced jobs.
I'll speak maybe to the projects that we've done in AI that we have pushed back from fear, which is a lot of them. The key is that the individuals whose jobs will be impacted, the person whose workflow will change, have to be a part of the process of developing AI from the onset. They have to feel like they're part of the solution, not that this is being done to them. They also need to see that the goal of implementation of the AI is not to replace them. As soon as someone feels that their job is going to be taken as the outcome, they, being the end user, will absolutely not implement this new technology.
And I love that you said in record, augmented, not replaced. I think that's really important to have on record. If I could jump to Mr. Otter, I think that's how I say your name. I like your testimony in regards to healthcare. As we have this massive doctor shortage and we have a lot of advancements happening with AI in healthcare. But I'm curious if you have any input on privacy. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest issues or concerns a lot of people have is how this is going to impact privacy, and healthcare being one of those areas of privacy. What do you think the government should be keeping an eye on in terms of ensuring citizen privacy when using AI?
I think it's a very big issue, and I don't think privacy, depending on the regulatory regime, is guaranteed and what can and cannot be tracked. Our phones are full-time surveillance devices that know, not only do they know all the things we do, but they report it to third parties for money, and then that is resold. So privacy will be compromised unless regulation prevents it, unless people have ownership of the right to privacy. So I think it's a very serious concern. If I may, Mr. Chair, may I respond very quickly to something that Ms. Jansen just said about the AI and jobs, which is I do not think we should take it as a historical fact that technology has always improved jobs. The Laudates were absolutely correct that power mills wiped out their employment. And not only that, wages didn't rise for 6 decades and growth was stunted, starvation increased. I'm not saying that these advances weren't ultimately beneficial, but these technological changes are never uniformly improving for all jobs or all people. There are almost always losers, people whose expertise is devalued. And when we make these big transitions, we should be prepared to help people adjust to those transitions. This will not be costless.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm going to intervene.
Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. And I think you bring up, valid points of learning from history. But ultimately, I think prosperity does prevail in advancement. But you have to, that's why, these committees and these studies are critical to that. And into that point, if I can go back to Ms. Jansen, you did refer to a lot of white-collar jobs benefiting or having sort of first access to AI. How do you think we prevent sort of that divide that could happen and probably will happen between the haves and have-nots, like creating a more polarized society of people who have access to technology that will further them both economically, socially, et cetera?
I think, what companies are incentivized to sell to everyone. Only selling to the elite few will not make profits. As we saw in the past with cars, electricity, radio, computers, mobile phones, the makers of these technologies are highly motivated to drive down their prices until everyone on the planet can afford them. Now, I fully recognize that there are places on the planet where there is not accessibility to internet, there is not accessibility to phones, but those prices continue to be driven downward because there is a desire to reach the entire population. If you look at OpenAI's ChatGPT, it's free. There is access for everyone to use it. Now, will we start with the white collar, higher wage earners likely using AI first? Absolutely, we will, because it costs a lot to develop AI right now.
Thank you.
But as those prices come down.
Thank you, Ms. Ferrari and Ms. Jensen. Mr. Van Bynen for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This has been a very informative discussion, and had I known what the text of Ms. Jensen's introduction being I would have used ChatGPT to develop my questions, but unfortunately I didn't have the time to do so. There is a concern about the benefits being equitable, and I think the point was raised initially by Ms. Hadfield. How do you feel the government should be part of ensuring that the distribution of wealth and the benefits is equitable across the economy?
Thank you for the question. I mean, part of the point about thinking about how we will adapt our regulatory environments is also thinking about how we adapt all our funding and tax and benefit requirement systems as well. I think that it's going to be a combination of involving workers, as Ms. Jansen has emphasized in the transformation process. If we're starting to see much bigger returns to capital, then maybe we need to figure out ways that workers are directly compensated for that as well. And then I think the last point is that, and this is why I think it's really important for Canada to be focusing on driving responsible adoption of these technologies because of the productivity challenges that we face. And ultimately, you need productivity to fund all of your, welfare systems and support systems, shorter work weeks, and so on. So I think there's a lot of ways to spread the benefits, but it'll take some deliberate efforts.
Now, we've heard the transition's been underway, and in fact, it's been evolving over the past 10, 15, and as many as 50 years. And the decision and the regulations seem to be built on lagging information or what we've experienced and are based on what we've been seeing. What kind of information should we be looking for? What kind of data should the government be gathering to be monitoring so that they can start developing leading indicators that would guide policy, strategy, and development? And I'll start with Mr. Autar.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's difficult because it is moving so fast, as Ms. Jansen and others noted, and it would actually be helpful, I think, to involve the private sector to try to get a sense, because even in the U.S., which is not the world's leader actually in information collection by any stretch of the imagination, we now field large surveys on who's using AI and sort of what they're doing with it, but we don't have a good sense. So one thing is to actually understand what tasks it's being applied to, in what sectors, for what activities. Another is to look at actually the nature of how jobs are changing, what occupations are growing and shrinking, what wages are being paid, and even ideally to understand from workers how their work is changing. I think so both coming at it from the worker perspective and the firm perspective would be potentially complementary.
And Ms. Hadfield, do you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you. It is moving very quickly, and I think we need to be thinking about agile methods for gaining increased visibility for governments. So I think you want to be very careful not to say, well, we'll do another 2-year study, because it's moving much faster than that. I think the lack of visibility that government has into how these technologies are developing, because first time in history, they're almost entirely behind corporate walls. But I do think it's really important to be at that ground level. So again, Ms. Jansen's testimony is very helpful on what this looks like on the ground level. I also know, like the co-counsel example that I gave you, I spoke to law firms that were implementing this. And I said, well, have you laid off all your junior lawyers yet? And they said, no, actually, we got more work than we know what to do with, because we now can take somebody's call one afternoon, and by the next day, we're ready to give them good advice and take steps. So there's actually a lot of unmet demand for effort, but you need to be at the ground level to find that out. So I would say developing agile methods for increasing government visibility into how things are changing on the ground is critical. SWAT teams.
Ms. Jansen, if you could add any comments. I only have about a minute or so left, and I wanted to get one more question in, so brief additional comments if you have any.
The only thing I'd add is that only about 20 to 30% of AI that's being built is actually being adopted. And so you would want to focus your attention on the sectors and the companies specifically that are adopting AI.
The next question is for Mr. Lepage-Richter. What are examples of the top countries that are preparing their workforces to deal with the impacts of AI? Are there examples out there that we could look at as best case scenarios?
That's a very good question. I don't have any international examples that jump to mind. In fact, in terms of examples, well, you have to look at the hidden costs associated with AI. When you interact, for example, with ChatGPT, the human work behind that is kind of swept away. But behind any system such as ChatGPT or other AI systems that are trained on a great deal of data, of course, there needs to be editing, formatting, and organizing of all of this. And that's carried out by humans. And it's not well paid. So there's lots of countries, for example, in emerging countries, where they've developed a workforce who's able to carry out these tasks at a very low cost. So the example I've got is not really an example that we want to emulate in Canada, because when we're talking about low-paying jobs associated to AI, we can think about the labeling of data. It's an essential job for all of these AI systems that we're using and developing, but it depends on millions of workers that do this data tagging manually for just a few cents. So in terms of international examples, well, they're not really the best ones that we'd like to follow, but we need to bear all of that in mind when it comes to social costs and human costs associated with the development of these technologies. Thank you very much, Mr. Lepage-Richet. And now, Madame Chabot, over to you for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of our witnesses. Mr. Lepage-Richet, I'm going to continue with you. We've heard from the OECD, and in the first hour we heard about unions' contributions and the question of objectives that have been developed by OECD on AI, such as sustainable development, and the fact it needs to be human-centered AI, it needs to be responsible. And you've talked about the fact that it needs to be equitable and responsible. So everyone agrees that it's being deployed, it is already being deployed, and automation and the use of robots, all of this is evolving. But what about getting up to cruising speed? What do we need to do upstream from a regulatory or ethical point of view to make sure that the impact on labour is actually positive rather than negative? What needs to be done? Well, I would say, well, how should I put it? For the moment, the approach that's been taken in Canada to assess and anticipate the impacts and risks of this technology is very much based on a self-assessment model. The proposed AI bill says that we need to set up a model so that companies can have self-governance and operate within certain parameters and make sure that they attenuate as much as possible the impact on their work. But with that type of approach, well, AI is developed in so many diverse sectors that at one point you then need to adapt these tools to each individual sector to represent well the interests of workers and users in these specific sectors. Quality of life, work, well-being is directly impacted by these technologies. And one example here is that we have to break this down in terms of risk in specific sectors, because there's specific framework to look at the environmental impact, the social impact, the human impact in general. But with these new technologies, we don't see things being done in such a specific way with specific sectors of activity. So that would be my first attempt at an answer. We need to have more specific analysis tools. Thank you very much. When it comes to self-regulation or self-governance, I've seen that as one of the criticisms for one bill that's currently being introduced by the government. This was external criticism levelled at this, where people were saying, is it actually responsible to ask companies who are developing these tools to carry out self-governance around these matters. I think that self-governance should be more political. It should not just be placed on the shoulders of the AI designers, AI companies. What do you think about that? Well, off the cuff, I've got a great deal of sympathy for your comment. That's the European model. The European strategy is very much based on independent or semi-independent committees who come and assess the impact of the deployment of these technologies. So we have to see whether this approach is actually realistic. If we look at the size of the machinery, the governmental machinery and public sector in Europe versus Canada, so realistically, even if I've got a great deal of sympathy for these comments that you've made, I do wonder to what extent the Canadian government would be able to set up that type of assessment model. So that's why we need to have analytical tools that are more tailored to different sectors. I think that would be a good compromise that we could strike in the Canadian context. But I've been quite open in terms of what I'm leaning towards in terms of solutions. And now, Ms. Hadfield, thank you very much for your comments. We've been talking about different sectors where AI is being deployed. You've cited an example in terms of legal aid. If we get this from a gender point of view, men, women, do you think that female-based jobs are more marginalized? Jobs will be more impacted by the deployment of AI? Are there more specific impacts on women or people who have a handicap, a disability?
Yes, top topics near and dear to my heart. I think it's hard to say at this point. I think actually the fact that what we are seeing is evidence that the current versions of large language models have a bigger impact on higher education occupations, that we won't see the sort of that pink collar effect that we maybe have seen in the past. I do think so. Like the legal application that I was talking about, it's true that it could displace sort of that paralegal level, which probably is female dominated. I haven't looked at the statistics on that. But it's actually it's doing legal work. It's doing legal work all the way through the ranks of the law firm. I think it's something for us to be paying attention to. I suspect this looks different than it has in previous automation waves, however.
Shabbat. Now we'll go to Madame Zarrillo, which will conclude this panel of witnesses. Madame Zarrillo for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do only have 6 minutes, and I did have some committee business I wanted to speak to first, but just so that witnesses can prepare, I'm going to ask Witness O'Toole and Witness Jansen. It has been proposed in this committee that there be a federal advisory council struck. And I wonder if I could ask both of you, after I finish my other committee business here, what top 3 topics each of you feel need to be considered at a federal advisory council? And I guess, first of all, if you think that's a good idea. But, Mr. Chair, before I go to the witnesses, I just wanted to respond to the letter the committee received back from Air Canada and our request for Mr. Russo, the CEO, to appear before committee. And we received a letter that I think outlines that Mr. Russo does not plan on coming to committee. So I was wondering if I could get consensus from the committee that we reach back to Air Canada and say that we strongly encourage Mr. Russo to arrive, because we don't want to have to summons.
Thank you, Ms. Zarrillo. I'm going to ask the clerk to speak to, you're right, your motion was adopted on November the 8th, and a letter went out, and the clerk will address it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As far as I know, the motion was adopted on November 8th. The information was sent to Air Canada, and the letter that you received a couple of days ago, it is the response to the motion. And as
the motion did request a CEO.
Yeah, exactly.
For Wednesday. And if not, we will have to summons, and I really don't want to have to do that. And I wonder if we could just get support of the committee on that.
What is the wish of the committee? Did Mr. H, did you have your finger, Ms. Gray or Mr. Aitchison on the issue of Air Canada?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I 100% support what Ms. Zerlo said. I think that we should be right back and tell the CEO of Air Canada he's welcome to bring whoever he'd like with him to help him out in his job, but this committee requested him, and that's who we expect.
Ms. Gray and then Mr. Fragas-Katos on, and then maybe Ms. Gray.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do support that as well. This is the will of this committee, and as my colleague had said, the CEO is welcome to bring other individuals. That is the will of the committee. This is what was decided on, and we do have other parliamentary tools in order to have the CEO attend. And without having to utilize those, hopefully just this discussion will implore the CEO to attend as the will of this committee. But if not, there are other tools that we can utilize. Thank you.
And on Ms. Gray's point, the committee has the ability to summons. Ms. Fragas-Katos.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope it doesn't get, excuse me, I hope it doesn't get to that point. But if it has to, then of course I won't speak for MP Zarrillo, but if it has to, certainly our side would support that and supports what's being called for here. Air Canada looks quite bad, to be very frank about it. They can bring staff here, but their leadership needs to answer questions about a very important matter.
Does that address? You still have time to get back. So I think it's very clear, Mentor, that the committee is unanimous, that it is the CEO the committee wants to appear before this committee.
At the earliest opportunity.
At the earliest opportunity. And he can bring, or she, I'm not sure who is this. The CEO can bring support staff, as Mr. Aitchison pointed out, but the committee wishes the CEO. Okay, seeing no dissension on that, then I will ask the clerk to clearly get back to Air Canada on the wishes of this committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize.
Zarrillo, you can go back to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank my committee members, and I apologize to the witnesses. I wonder if I could go to witness O'Toole then and then witness Jansen, and if we run out of time, if either of those witnesses would like to write to the committee in writing, that would be great. So my question is around a federal advisory council that was proposed in past witnesses, and I wonder if, Mr. O'Toole, if you could talk about the top 3 topics that you think should be considered in a federal advisory council, and then Ms. Jansen, the same question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do support the idea of a federal advisory council. As all folks here today have testified, this is moving very fast. It poses new opportunities, new challenges, and bringing in top expertise in an advisory role is an excellent idea. The 3 topics I would most address, one is how to use the technology to augment labor rather than automate. And I don't think we should take as a given that augmentation necessarily occurs. Countries steer technologies. Nuclear energy is used by North Korea solely for offensive weapons. It's used solely by Japan solely for energy generation. They have no offensive nuclear weapons. That's a choice of a country. It's not a characteristic of a technology. So how to use it well to augment workers is the first thing. The second thing is protections for workers. As I noted, undue surveillance, high stakes decision makings by opaque algorithms, and use AI's appropriation of workers' creative works without compensation should be regulated. We have fair use when it comes to intellectual property. It just, the laws were not written for AI. Finally, I would say visibility into these technologies. They are opaque. They're making high stakes decisions, and often the creators of technologies will not even disclose what sources of data have been used for training. I don't think that's acceptable. And I think there's a public interest making sure that machines that are making important decisions and valuable decisions, I use AI, I support AI, need to be understandable to regulators and to consumers.
Thank you so much, and I'm so interested in this appropriation of expertise and creativity without compensation. Ms. Jansen, do you have 3 topics that you would want to have considered?
Ms. Jansen, you may be on mute. We cannot hear you.
No, I'm not on mute.
Okay, you're fine now. You're fine now.
Okay. The cat's out of the bag with AI. We're not putting it back. And so it to me, I would have the committee, which by the way, yes, I am fully supportive of the committee, but I would have the committee focus on what education and upskilling and supports do we need to provide to our workforce as this begins to roll out. You know, identifying those early disrupted professions, following them, seeing what lessons can be learned from those professions, and then perfecting that change management as it rolls out across all sectors and professions. And then also the responsible AI piece, the transparency, the accountability, the privacy, all of those pieces that come with responsible AI and the impacts directly impacting workers would be the areas I would focus on.
Is that it, Ms. Cirillo? Okay. With that, we don't have enough time to go with another round, so we have 1 minute left. I'll call for adjournment of the committee meeting. Meeting adjourned.